Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 7, I guess it is, of Rewriting Skyscraper History. I'm Carol Willis. I'm the founder, director, and curator of the Skyscraper Museum. I have a feeling that most of you know that because I think a lot of you have been veterans of the previous weeks and followers of this topic. I know we have a lot of people who are architectural historians and architects. We also have a large number contingent from Chicago. Because most of the conversation about the history of the skyscraper has been Chicago versus New York, and that's the storyline that we have followed very much in the kind of the setup of the previous weeks. We wanted to be sure when it was proposed to me by George Thomas, who I'm going to introduce in just a moment, that we be a little more inclusive in the way that we looked at the cities that produce tall buildings, as well as a narrative, as various narratives of skyscraper history that have issues that George's work on Philadelphia and the culture of engineering, as we'll call it, in the city of Philadelphia informs the built environment and the architects who practice there. That's one of the topics we want to talk about tonight. And so I'm going to briefly but give George a longer introduction than the rest of our speakers. And the other speakers, Donald Friedman and Gerald Larson, I'm going to introduce in the context of when I share my screen, and I'll show you the covers of their books and talk a little bit about their expertise. So George Thomas is a cultural and architectural historian practicing with Susan Negress Snyder, a registered architect in Civic Visions, which is a firm based in Philadelphia. George has been a national pioneer in documentation of National Register historic districts and individual listings to secure historic preservation tax credits for rehabilitation projects. For more than 30 years, he's taught at the University of Pennsylvania, where his courses seek to understand the interconnection between history and the patterns of modern life. In 1978, he was one of the founders of Penn's program in historic preservation, and he taught there until 2002. George has written and lectured widely on 19th and early 20th century architecture, and especially American architecture, with a focus on the relationship between cultural innovation and architectural design. His books include Frank Furness, The Complete Works, William L. Price, From Arts and Crafts to Modern Design, the buildings of the United States, Philadelphia and Eastern Pennsylvania in the SAH series, as well as Frank Furness, Architecture in the Age of the Great Machines. George now teaches at Harvard's GSD, where he's the co-director in the Masters of Design Studies program in critical conversation. Not conversation, he's very good at that as well, but in critical conservation. And teaches a couple of classes that with interesting titles, Power and Place, Culture and Conflict in the Built Environment, and Culture, Conservation, and Design. So what I'm going to do now is to share my screen and start with slides and continue then with my PowerPoint with a few introductory remarks about the series, Rewriting Skyscraper History, looking back from the 21st century. The title for George Thomas's talk tonight, An Alternate History of the American Skyscraper, Joseph Wilson of Philadelphia, is going to emphasize the engineer architect Joseph Wilson, but really the larger urban context of Philadelphia, and of course George's favorite, Frank Furness. We're in that way coming, there we go. The book, the aforementioned book, Frank Furness, Architecture in the Age of the Great Machines, you can see the cover of here, is a spectacular overview of an architect that I think we all admire for what seems to be his idiosyncrasy, but we might discuss tonight is the typical nature of Furness in the context of engineering culture in his home city of Philadelphia. Now, Donald Friedman has just produced The Structure of Skyscrapers in America, 1871 to 1900. And this book is now out. It can be acquired at the moment only through through APT, Architecture Preservation Technology website. But I will mention to you in particular a recent webinar that Don did through SAH, the Society of Architectural Historians. And if you go to their website, you'll be able to see about an hour and a half of a background discussion by Don, and then a Q&A about technical issues that I'm sure would interest George a great deal too, because it all has to do with historic preservation and conservation issues. Don will be talking about his book in our lecture series that will continue in book talks in a long format in February, some date in February. Just check our website. The blog that I highly recommend by Gerald Larson, who is the upper right-hand corner architecture professor, is indeed a professor now emeritus from the University of Cincinnati, where he for many years taught in the design school, and is a great expert on the Chicago School, which he in enormous depth and detail elaborates in the blog, The Chicago School of Architecture, one of the pages of which you see here with one of the pertinent monuments in a fairly recent post. As you can see, the first real use of exterior iron framing, the Phoenix Building in Chicago, that Gerald will give us some background on in the discussion. So a little bit of tonight's talk is instigated by the long-running discussion and debate about the nature of invention of the curtain wall, where that took place, where in the world indeed it took place, because George is going to mention a European precedent, perhaps. It's a debate that seems to have concentrated so much of the energy and argument in the 20th century, because the idea of creating a metal frame really informed much of the way that we thought about the modernist narrative of the skyscraper. And I include here in the slides, just very briefly, a symposium which was in many ways the genesis for this rebuttal series, which is our fall semester on rewriting skyscraper history. Back in the a year ago, in October in 2019, the Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat put together a steering committee of skyscraper experts and historians and architects who would weigh in on trying to shape this debate and settle, they said, once and for all, what was the first skyscraper. Out of that effort, you see some of the co-conspirators in the anti-first argument assembled here and trying to, it happened to have been Halloween evening that we took this picture, and it was the conclusion of the symposium. You see on the left me, then you see Gerald Larson, you see Gail Fensky, Tom Leslie, and then Don Friedman over on the right. And we were all pointing at the documentary photographs of the demolition of the home insurance building taken famously by Richard Nickel that had been cited in many a study. And I'm getting rid of something on my screen in case that's bothering people as it's bothering me. So this effort to to overcome, let me see if I can go back, to overcome the whether you call it a myth, the distraction, the centrality of this issue of the home insurance building being the first skyscraper, which is so perpetrated in the Chicago narrative of the birthplace of the skyscraper, is something that Jerry Larson has been trying to debunk for about 30 years. He's nodding vigorously, you see him on the side, because back in the 1980s, he wrote a scholarly article for the Society of Architectural Historians to clearly articulate why the home insurance building was not the first skeleton frame. It wasn't even a skeleton frame. And I'm going to let him make that argument for you because we are going to engage in one of the three questions, kind of central themes that we explore tonight, the idea of the metal skeleton and the curtain wall. And this is one of the slides that we'll come back to that Jerry will call upon, because there's some very early precedents for thinking about metal frames and thinking about large expanses of glass, which some people might call curtain walls. But I'll go quickly past that in order to suggest the third theme that we're going to explore, and that is the modernist narrative. And here we see in a slide that was shown at that symposium with the home insurance building, just partial over there on the left, a picture of Philip Johnson showing the models that were made for a Museum of Modern Art exhibition on the early modern architecture of Chicago, as you see in the caption, way back in 1933, when Mies van der Rohe had not yet even had the dream, or perhaps he had had the dream, but certainly not the opportunity to build a skyscraper of metal and glass like the Seagram building, which so dominated the definition of the modernist paradigm. So this slide that Jerry will talk more about also clearly raises the kinship and the kind of legacy or lineage of the metal frame. I'll let Jerry talk about that. And here was his candidate that you saw in the blog for the Phoenix building and the first curtain wall. And there is the Phoenix building, what it looks like not on that simple back wall with its high or the blank technology of the Broad Streets station by Joseph Wilson that George is going to talk about. So I will just preview this idea of fallacy of the first, which is something I want to mention now that I'm going to talk about in another lecture that we've added to the series that will be in December, which is called Better Questions and Better Definition, we hope, of what equals the definition of the tall building that is what is the first skyscraper. Again, call on George to introduce some of the topics that he wants to talk about, then share his screen and illustrate those a little bit so that we know what page we're on for the rest of our 45 minutes.
Thank you, Carol. This is going to be fun. As you can tell, I'm in the attic of the Academy of Fine Arts, where I'm speaking from. Frank Furness's steel, iron, and glass roofing structure over his Academy building of 1871. But I want to talk with you today about Joseph Wilson and his contributions to the engineering and design issues of the modern office building. But I began first with a generational cropping. Those of us who are slightly older, I'm guessing Jerry is at least 45 and Carol may be in her 30s. But those of us who are slightly older know that when we first looked at the history of American architecture and of modern architecture, we were confronted with the propagandist international style title of Henry Russell Hitchcock and Philip Johnson, and the realization when we looked at our world that this was largely unbuilt and un-American and not here. So that becomes, in a sense, the touchstone of trying to understand an architecture that was built but not written about, and and architecture that wasn't built and was written about. But the counter to that, and I think Siegfried Gideon's real counter to Hitchcock, was the idea that we should look at the world. He said, go out and look for industry and for the sources and ideas. And in the process, he took us into hog slaughtering sites in Cincinnati and all sorts of places in which he began to make it clear that modern was not some intellectual construct of Europe, but in fact, part of the life where we lived. And if you looked in any way, shape, or form at the world around you, you began to realize that the narrative that we were being taught as late as the 1960s, Europe was the center of the origins of modernity, didn't make any sense. In something as simple as the automobile, if you looked at the production of the United States, 3.7 million cars, all the rest of the world, 200,000 cars, or the typical, and this is a mid-price European car, a Vauxhall at $5,400 versus a 1924 Chevy at $495. You realize that Americans were the early adopters. They were the ones who really moved into the modern world with comfort and ease. And that then raises another question that needs to be looked at as we try to understand what's going on, who the originators are in American architecture. The most critical point is to get with the reality that American architecture is not one thing, it's many things. And each separate, distinct cultural region had its own architecture and its own sort of undercurrents and forces. And to make that point, I compare two buildings that are almost exactly identical, Frank Furness's Academy of Fine Arts and Henry Hobson Richardson's Trinity Church, Boston. Built beginning at the same point. Furness gets done in 4 years, his building lags on for almost 20. This is a building of iron and steel and glass, modern connectivity in terms technology from factories and like, while Richardson bragged and has nothing of that new iron, no modern materials. In that difference, you begin to realize that it is a culture from Boston. That Boston is about history in Europe, and Philadelphia is about industry and the future. And so these stories need to be laid together to begin to see the larger picture of what's going on. While Jim O'Gorman and I were working on Frank Furness back in 1971 for the Philadelphia Museum of Art, I acquired the papers and photographs of William Price, who had been a Frank Furness pupil. And comparing his work to Hitchcock's architecture of the 19th and 20th centuries in the Pelican series, it didn't seem to be terribly interesting or important. But while we were doing this, Servan Robinson was photographing New York skyscrapers and making the point that they were pretty wonderful architecture too. And as I looked at what I had in my files and then went to Atlantic City and saw the Tremor, I could see that the Tremor, in fact, was the root of much of this fabulous architecture of the 1920s. Before the so-called Art Deco show of 1925, the Tremor is built in 1914. The American Radiator is built in 1924. The streamline aesthetic is here. This is clearly an original style of architecture, and it had completely disappeared from the histories, was left out in every regard, didn't exist in any way, shape, or form. So that got me wondering, and it's been part of my pursuit for the last 30, 40 years, to try to understand why Philadelphia looks the way it does and works the way it does. And my central answer at this point is that it's the product of the core cultural institution of the city, which is the Franklin Institute, which is an institute of science and technology, and most particularly applied science, whose members became the leaders of all of the major Philadelphia institutions, businesses, civic organizations, and so on. And in the process, shaped the culture of the city, shaped the values of the city, shaped the possibilities, and encouraged them to use modern materials and modern technologies. But the other piece of Philly is that its main industry, its main corporate culture was the Pennsylvania Railroad, which in its own literature bragged that it's the center of a assembly line 14,000 miles long. I think that's all the little tendrils of this system. But what you see is a railroad that spanned from New York to Philadelphia to Pittsburgh and Chicago and St. Louis, basically the heart of industrial America, and became the standard railroad, the railroad by which the American industry set its forms and standards, because it was run not by financiers like the New York Central, but by engineers, people who had worked their way up through the system, understanding and appreciating the values of the railroad itself. Their culture, their city, produces the great sort of cultural event of Philly of the late 19th century, the Centennial Exhibition. But the building that first tells the story of what the exhibition is going to be about is Furness's Academy of Fine Arts, which has, I don't know if you can see my pointer here, but has big ventilators on the top of its facade that are just like factory ventilators. And the interior above the main long gallery is a glass and steel and iron structure with operating ventilators straight out of industrial Philadelphia. This is a building that is designed to be a gallery, a museum, and a school, and a factory. And it's that juxtaposition of the real world with civic that makes this building so remarkable. The fair itself almost collapsed. That it should have failed with the 1873 enormous depression that caused Frank Furness to have to let Louis Sullivan go, but it didn't because the Pennsylvania Railroad turned over their main designer engineer, Joe Wilson, and significant capital to make the fair happen. The Pennsy had double and triple tracked its entire railroad from the west to Philly to bring the customers. And they gave Wilson the task of figuring out how to build an entire amazing World's Fair in less than a year and at half the cost of the original budget. Wilson's going to figure this out by using off-the-shelf parts, which he's going to assemble into gigantic buildings with the idea that when the fair is over, they can sell the parts back into the supply chain and basically rent the materials while not having to actually pay for the stuff. And they make it possible in terms of speed by using the efficiency of the railroad, setting up tracks through the site, laying out logistical sites so that the materials first for the construction and then for the exhibits can be offloaded directly where they need to be. Wilson is going to be, to my mind, one of the really remarkable figures of the 19th century. He worked for 20 years in the Pennsylvania Railroad offices, studied engineering at Rensselaer, but then moved to 2 years of work in Frederick Genth's laboratory, looking at the chemistry and metallurgy of iron and steel. He's a rare engineer who actually understands not just the physics, but also the materials. And, thank goodness, he left us this incredible work, catalog of work executed, which was published in 1885 after 9 years of practice. They opened in 1876. And in it are some 27 pages, double-spaced columns of all the projects, work, bridges, buildings, houses, factories, etc., that they did. It's just an unbelievable record and gives you a sense of this national firm that nobody has probably ever heard of, but who were central to the sort of the narrative of American architecture of the 19th century. In the course of writing a little piece about A.J. Drexel's Institute of Technology, which is now Drexel University, I ran across this weird interview with Wilson as part of a review for the British Institute of Engineers that was looking at Ed Shanklin's book on Chicago construction. And as an aside, Joe says, yeah, we'd done that 20 years earlier in Philadelphia when I was doing this railroad station. And when you then look at the station, you begin to see what he's talking about. This whole south wall, which is the wall over on the left, this big wall with the windows, you can see is unlike what you would expect. It's 8 stories high, but it stays thin throughout. And that becomes the tell that there's something weird going on here. And Joe says, yeah, that's where I used a parallelepipeds of steel and iron, and I carried the wall on the frame, and I built this thing. And then my dotted line over here is where that wall was in the building. The Wilson building is over here, and Furness has this big piece over here. But it's this line of columns that marks what that wall was and begins to give us a clue that something really unusual is in fact happening here. Joe's really interesting because Joe has the gift of historical imagination. He can look at a medieval half-timber wall, see the wood as a frame and the masonry infill in that frame, and say to himself, I can do that in steel and brick, which he says. He writes about this as a point of contact. So this leads me to see Wilson as one of the players because of his knowledge and because of the insights that he has. This is the next building that really blows my mind. The little red outline is a two-story bank for A.J. Drexel that the Wilson firm had done in the early 1880s. And then Drexel manages to buy the property behind his bank, and then a property over on the other side of a small bank that is appropriately named the Independence Bank. They won't sell, they're eerily independent. But Drexel buys this piece, and the game is, can you build a building on top of the existing Drexel Bank that never causes the Drexel Bank to close while protecting the Independence Bank to build a new building? And the answer is going to be yes. And the building that you see on the right is that building, 6 stories atop the Drexel Bank, 10 stories at the rear, stock exchange in the wing beyond the Independence Bank. An incredibly interesting effort at using steel and iron to construct a modern steel frame wind braced building. So that leads me to the point that I want to end with for this introductory note. And that is that, to my mind, you look to cities where engineering was central to the culture to see where innovation is going to occur. And that began in Philadelphia in the middle of the 19th century with the Franklin Institute and its members. It then spreads to Glasgow and to Berlin and to other cities where engineering is at the core. And that becomes the basis of the future world that we live in. So from that, I want to jump off into all sorts of questions. I mean, Jerry has found my real point of interest. Furness is studying with George Post and Richard Morris Hunt's atelier in New York in the 1850s. And George Post is doing all the early talks about iron construction for the AIA that Frank is attending, and seeing how easy it is to use these materials and why shouldn't you use these materials. So it seems to me that Jerry's big question, which is how this all begins, and it's not in Chicago, is, I think, a critical point to begin to understand. And my point here is to add Philly and its engineering culture and their knowledge and their hinterland and the ability to spread these ideas. When you look at St. Louis and you look at all the buildings along the railroad, you see Philly. And that, I think, is an important piece that one suspects, given that Louis Sullivan is Frank's student in Chicago, that begins to tell a story of what the actual flow of ideas was.
Great, thank you, George. Actually, before we let Jerry launch, did you want to talk about this last slide or not?
Let me throw this in, just
Sure.
part of this tale. This is the building that Winston Wiseman wrote about in an early article saying, isn't this the first skyscraper? This is the Jane building in Philadelphia on Chestnut Street with its 8-story main block and then surmounted by 2-story tower that's quite extraordinary in the Gothic style, and that was flanked by mortars and pestles, which were the pharmacist's signal. Jane sold an addictive beverage, a brilliant sales plan that made you want one of his tonics every morning. And the mortars and pestles, I think, were the sort of clue to look at this thing and say, wow, let's have one. But Wiseman says, is the tall building the steel frame, or is it just tall? And in this instance, the Jane building is 8 stories plus its tower, 10, almost 11 stories. And that leads into all sorts of directions. So let me jump from that, stop my share, and I'll clear the screen.
Okay. So before we let Jerry launch into what I'm sure is a long discussion of primacy, what I'd like to do is to bring Don Friedman into to address the question that I know that he's talked about so many times before, and he does cite in his book, and that is the engineering culture, especially bridge engineers. Mm-hmm. And Don, I wonder if you have particular thoughts about Philadelphia or whatever else you want to say about bridge engineers, but I'm also going to ask you, because George makes a point in his longer talk about William Sellers, and the big hand is coming here. William Sellers and wire cable and other kinds of metal technologies, right? So the creation of the industrial production of metal construction parts. I'm thinking also of, I was first introduced to Phoenix columns by Don and that long discussion, which is in the Philadelphia area. So could you talk a little bit about the engineering technology and the history of technology with respect to those questions?
Sure. I mean, one way of looking at this question is to separate the birth of the skyscraper, whatever that means, from the advances of technology that are taking place in the 19th century. And I always like to point out, I'm a structural engineer. My profession barely existed in this country in 1850. I mean, there were a few people doing it, but it was, you could probably fill up a classroom with them. And it is, the idea of engineered structure takes a long time to reach the building world because it was never necessary. You needed structural engineers to build big bridges. And if you look at the world of the built environment in the United States in, let's say, 1880, which is a year that's sort of in the middle of George's talk, the vast majority of engineers are working on bridges and civil structures like that. They're not working on buildings. There's a very small number doing it. And the reason, again, is most buildings didn't need engineers. If you were using metal beams in your floor to get a fireproof building, you would let the iron contractor design those beams. And that meant that, a very small number of engineers working for iron contractors could deal with a very large number of buildings. And a lot of it was turned into tables because it was, again, such simple structure. As buildings get taller later in the century and get more slender, the need for wind bracing starts to drive designers, architects and owners towards getting engineers involved. And if you look at some of the possibly made up, possibly serious concerns in the press about some of the very tall, slender buildings, the supposed panic about the Tower building in New York, for example. This is addressed by saying, well, we're not just going to build the building, we're going to have the structure designed. And that's where you get into this whole idea of wind bracing as a bridge truss stood on end. So for me, the story of structure in tall buildings, as opposed to the story of skyscrapers, is the story of industrialized construction and engineering design entering the building world where they previously had not really been part of things. You get the beginning of industrialization in buildings in the 19th century in the US with things like cast iron, industrialized production of brick, and then after the midpoint of the century, wrought iron comes in. It takes a long time for steel to get to be cheap enough that people are willing to use it. But the fact that people are using industrialized products doesn't mean that they're necessarily using them in what an engineer would call a rational way. And that takes a long time, and a lot of it comes from comes from bridge design. I'm looking at the roof trusses behind George, and the difference between a long span roof and a bridge is where is it? Is it between? Is it spanning over a river gorge, or is it spanning between two masonry walls? That's the difference. So that's sort of one take on the question you asked me.
One piece that strikes me that's interesting is the way that Furness solved the problem of carrying the masonry gallery above a glass roof studio.
Yeah.
Is basically with a big steel bridge truss that spans from studio to studio. And his assistant, his colleague on this, is the head of the building committee of the Academy, a bridge engineer, who says this, Frank has 3 drawings. I don't know what I'm going to do here. I don't know what I'm going to sort of find little details. And then they just suddenly go, oh, we'll do this. And you suddenly see, oh yeah, this is where, in a sense, the steel meets the brick in a new creative way. And the counter that I would also add for you is to know that Joe, in his book, which is just amazing, it's online, has like 17 pages just of bridges, because he's building bridges all over this Western hemisphere. So there's an extraordinary story that Wilson brings of incredible technological experience that then turns into, what can I as a professional do in my new world? Yeah.
One last thought, and then I'll get out of Jerry's way. And that is that for bridge engineers, carrying a brick wall was a relief, because they were used to carrying locomotives, which not only were concentrated, very heavy loads, but steam locomotives pounded the rails. So it was a dynamic load that was very difficult to support. Whereas the big brick wall, it may be a heavy load, but it's static. It just sits there. So it's actually, from the engineering perspective, it's a lot easier to carry the big brick wall than it is to carry a train.
The trick was to conceive it.
Yeah.
Yeah, but as an architect, what he did was on the exterior, he used the brickwork to express it. And I couldn't figure out what he was doing there until you showed me that truss, and then everything made sense.
Well, Jerry, when we did the restoration of the Academy back in '73, that whole section was covered with concrete.
No.
Because they were afraid of fires from buildings across the street.
Wow.
And so we put a sprinkler pipe above it and cleared the concrete off. And all of a sudden you could see what the whole building was about.
Wow.
The amazing thing was that in the early reviews of the building, the art critics looking at the building, they hate all the fussy stuff and they completely ignore the truss. They don't even see it. Amazing.
Okay.
Yep.
Yes, way back in 1983, I decided that it would be a good thing to present a paper at the SAH convention on the home insurance building, as it would be 100 years old in 1984. And lo and behold, it wasn't skeletal framed. I was able to actually recreate the entire construction of the building. And I'm not going to get into the particulars of it. It's on my blog if you want to see it. But it's hard killing an urban legend, my friends. It's really hard, especially when you've got a whole city making money on it, okay? I'm very thankful for the next generation, meaning Thomas Leslie, taking over this argument. And we're slowly but surely just bringing the historical record up to date and being accurate. Well, George showed you the Broad Street station of the Pennsylvania Railroad. That wall was there in '79. And I'm going to kind of use your quote there. Well, New York did the same thing 25 years earlier, okay? And in one of these grain elevators. So if we're going to go back, I give James Bogardus the credit for inventing and patenting iron skeletal framing in 1950. In 1850, excuse me. And then in 1855, he puts brick panels on the iron frame, first in the McCulloch Shot Tower. So from my standpoint, that's where we've got masonry curtain walls sitting on an iron skeletal frame, 1855 in New York, built by a New Yorker. He went on and did another tower, and then he actually did a 2-story sugar warehouse in Cuba that Margot Gale documented, which was excellent. And then we get to Daniel Badger picks up this technique, and in 1860, as you see the drawing here, he builds a 7-story grain warehouse in South Brooklyn Docks that again has a cast iron exterior structure infilled with 12 inches of brick. So he's using the same technique as well. And then in 1862, he does one in Philadelphia. This is the only picture I can find, and I apologize for its quality, but at least I was happy to find some documentation that this building existed, and it was for the Pennsylvania Railroad. So George, my challenge to you is there a connection between this building and what Wilson did in 79? Because it's the same company.
Wilson is in fact at that point the staff engineer for the railroad. So my assumption is that he's reviewing this thing for the railroad and saying it'll work and that they should do it. He and his brother John, who was like a year older, had by that point become their father had been the engineer for the railroad from the 40s to the 60s. They take over in 60 and run the shops of the railroad until they move off to their own practice in 76. So they would have been there and certainly part of this decision-making process. When that's done, it makes perfect sense that if they could figure out the structure, and Joe could, they would be saying, yeah, let's build it.
I'm quite sure that's our link.
Yeah.
And so when I started this whole thing, there really wasn't a narrative that showed you. New York had its history, Chicago had its history, but nobody knit the two together. And here we are now starting to knit these together. First use of this in a exterior wall of a building, I still think is going to be the Equitable building in New York of 1867. And it's going to be, my theory is that architects began and contractors began to experiment with exterior iron framing in the light courts of buildings because they don't have to worry about the building code, number one. Number two, they're not doing any damage to the walls that are giving them the wind bracing because they can open up the walls around the light court. And so I think the first one is the first skyscraper, as far as I'm concerned. So, I mean, here's this little kismet, is that the Equitable building, 1867, I think is the first skyscraper. Mm-hmm. My definition of skyscraper is you use the elevator to add more floors so that you can pay for the real estate in New York. And so Henry Hyde gets the credit for coming up with that idea, actually. So if we're going to say who's the father of the skyscraper, probably Henry Hyde. First architect to design it. Well, George Post didn't design it, but he made it work. And I think he probably did the iron framing in the court. Let's go to the next slide of the produce exchange. Produce exchange, there we go. Now here's your iron skeletal framing in the courtyard of the New York Produce Exchange that George Post designed in 1881. There are going to be brick panels filling in the panels, the areas that will not have glass. So he's, again, using this technique. The French are doing this already too. Jules Saulnier in the Meunier chocolate factory is putting masonry on an iron frame. But when I saw this picture that Sarah Landau had in her book, everything came together for me, is that it was in these exterior walls of these light courts that architects first were able to experiment and perfect this system. And so then when I go back, I can see that George Post uses it also in the Mills building, right in front of where the elevator core is. And I took, again, I would have prepared a lecture for you, but if you digitally enhance the lobby of the Equitable building, you will see through the skylight all windows. And that suggests to me, of course, then that he's got iron framing already in 1867 in those walls. So New York, in my book, gets credit for developing the skyscraper. New York gets credit for developing the iron frame, and George Post gets the credit, not William LeBaron Jenney, and Chicago for not only doing the first skyscraper, but also beginning to incorporate the iron frame in the exterior of a building. So then, where does Chicago fit in all this? I want to pause that just for a second, though, because I want to go back to Philadelphia, because when I go to Chicago, I'm jumping now to 1884, and I really like George Papers today on the engineering aspect of the aesthetics, but one thing he didn't have a chance to talk about was he's already laid out the aesthetic of an American style that Philadelphia was pursuing before the fair, primarily led by the University of Pennsylvania's provost, Charles Stillé. Is that how you pronounce it, George? Stillé? Stillé, where he's bringing in, including Furness's father, to talk about modern American design in the 1870s. And so George laid out this wonderfully rich heritage of Philadelphia's pursuing an American modern aesthetic in the 1870s, capped during the fair when they bring in Christopher Dresser, one of Britain's leading design reform designers, to give a series of lectures on modern design. And that's 1876. So thanks, George, because when you couple that with this engineered industrial aesthetic that is emerging with the Wilson brothers, you want to ask, why didn't it continue? Why didn't, you asked the question and you showed it was Richardson was the way future, not Furness.
Yeah, let me give you a couple of quick answers on that. The Richardson question is, Sullivan makes the comment about how wonderful the Marshall Field Warehouse building is in his kindergarten chats. And that, I think, is then picked up by, no, it's picked up by Hitchcock, who says, reading Sullivan's autobiography of an idea, that there's no way that an architect as important as Sullivan could have been influenced by Frank Furness. And so in a sense, what we're seeing is that, in a sense, the MoMA modern narrative warped the entire story of American architectural history and destroyed it. And that leads me to, I was at a Bruno Latour talk at Harvard a couple of years ago, and he made the point, and it's really critical, that facts, in a sense, are only part of the context that creates them. And that in the end, you have to understand the context and the fact. And so the facts that we all learned and that have become the narrative that everybody tells are, in a sense, the MoMA, Europe invents it, how do we get from Gropius back to America? That's Sullivan, that leads then in their narrative to Richardson. And so you see this crazily distorted story in which a guy who tells you that he never used a modern piece of material in his building and is looking entirely to European sources is the source of modern architecture. So that in a sense has, with O'Gorman as my main teacher early on, who was so into Richardson, it took me 30 years to get him to agree that Furness was about the future and Richardson was about the past. But the larger issue I've been digging into is how all these sort of extreme possibilities run through Philly, but then they leave. And that's really the big question. What happened? And in large measure, it's because the Philadelphia architectural community, with two exceptions, couldn't take the hammering of the New York critics, who hated the fact that Philadelphia didn't look like New York and England. And that became their point of, comment at every point. The only guy who escapes is Will Price, who goes off and does the Blenheim and the Traymore and opens his own second office in Indianapolis because the car inventors, the car part guys, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway guys will hire him out there because they're not afraid of the modern world. And then Price also does railroad stations all the way to Chicago because the Pennsylvania Railroad isn't afraid of the modern world. So in a sense, what you're seeing is the power of culture. And that culture then becomes the narrative. And when the culture becomes the narrative without an understanding of the history, then you get the mess that we've been in for 80 years.
Couldn't disagree with you. I want to show that one Chicago thing. So if it wasn't the home insurance building, I've been pursuing this photo for probably 30 years. And I finally got it from urbanremains.com. They have a really great site, but everybody, I think, knows the Rookery interior court, but that wasn't the first of what Root employed. And by the way, let's remember that Root is from New York. He had the same education that George Post had. They both went to NYU. And I am calling John Welborn Root Georgie Jr. Because the more that I understand Root's work, the more I can find a George Post precedent for it, including the Courtyard. The Rookery is nothing more than the New York Produce Exchange updated. But anyway, the home insurance building didn't have beams between its columns at every floor, which I presented in Chicago in December. Lee Gray, who did an earlier talk in this series, really excited my understanding of the importance of daylighting in these pre-electric elevators. And so what you're seeing here is the back of the elevator core in the Phoenix building. So what Root decides to do is he's got a very thin site. He's got to get daylight, not only into the corridor, but also into the elevator cabs. And so he uses basically the iron structure that's also supporting the elevator rails to also support independent brick panels on every floor. And Gunny Harbo and the gang gave me a detail of the Rookery that comes right after this, and they just changed the detailing a little bit. But in the Phoenix, they have two shelf angles supporting two withes of masonry on each floor. And so in my book, I call this the first example in Chicago of using iron skeletal framing, which again will be perfected by Root in the wall of the Rookery's atrium. One of the missing pieces here is that, going back to Don's talk, was the contractor, is that it's George Fuller, who I think is critical to understanding how this technology evolves in Chicago, because the next thing after the Rookery, of course, is going to be, he's going to take the Rookery and turn it inside out, and we have the Tacoma building. Mm-hmm. And the one name that is constant is George Fuller. And he goes back to New York too, right? Because he comes to Chicago from New York, being the head of the Peabody and Stearns office in New York. His last building was United Bank building. Right. So we have all these New York connections and precedents that slowly but surely are going to be incorporated in Chicago buildings.
A couple of interesting points about this. It reminds me of the main back wall of the Traymore Hotel, which has a bank of little tiny windows going up. And what that was the elevator bank, which with glass elevators, so that when you rode up the 17 stories of the Traymore, you're looking down the boardwalk in a sort of amusement ride elevator. But Will Price's in-law is a guy named Turner, and he's going to found Turner Construction. So and they had come out of the Pennsylvania Railroad culture. So that you start to see how all these pieces interweave. And I think that's really the critical point. that we're probably not going to find a first, but we're going to find lots of links and connections and a much broader culture that isn't about old elite issues. It's about engineering. And if we can sort of get the story to look at the culture of engineering and look at the connections between all these people and their railroads and their businesses, we probably start to get closer to a story that is, on the one hand, an American story, and on the other hand, is very much a story of the second half of the 19th century.
I got a better elevator ride than your 17-story one, and that is the elevators in the Masonic Temple.
Yeah.
Because that went up 300 feet, and that was all, again, just like the wall here, all glass. And so you're going up 300 feet in this elevator overlooking Lake Michigan. It had to have been a stunning ride.
That'd be amazing. Yeah.
Yes, if you didn't puke first.
Let me interrupt in order to move things along a little bit, and we're very close to our normal ending time. Let's say we go another 5 minutes or so in order to make sure that we touch on a few important topics. And I wanted to bring Don back into the discussion a little bit. But before I forget, let me mention, when you say Turner, I think concrete, right? And one thing we are not talking about at all is the invention of concrete systems in the 19th century, that if you look back from the 21st century are the entire story of structural systems for the 21st century. So that's an interesting thing to throw into the mix.
Remember, Frank Furness is out there inventing reinforced concrete systems and patenting various schemes and systems, and is described in these engineering narratives as part of this story.
Well, I want to give our engineer, Don, a chance to say something about two topics. One, I know he's a big fan of George B. Post, so he may want to chime in a little bit of admiration there. But there's another topic that he talks about in his book and in the SAH webinar, on a long form webinar on his book that was just released, and that is, I think, a very interesting concept that takes the architect out of the equation a little bit, not so much to privilege the engineer, but to think about the history of technology. And I think Don calls it an emphasis not on the invention and innovation of technologies, but finding an average technology, which is kind of the operative principle in the construction, in the building industry, and in building development. So Don, I wonder if you might elaborate on that a little bit.
Sure. I mean, I guess part of the issue is that every building is unique. Even when they're twins, they're unique. As I like to point out to people, that the two World Trade Center towers built in the late 60s were not identical. It's very difficult to find two buildings that are truly identical. Whereas the technology that's in them may be identical across thousands of buildings. And therefore, there's a difference between the way that you approach architectural history, where the designer's intent matters very much, as opposed to how you approach the history of technology, where it's what is available. And there's a dialogue going on between the people who produce it and the people who use it. I could get into the whole social construction of technology morass if I head too far in that direction. People are, there is just this amazing flourishing of structural concepts starting in the late 19th century, maybe in the 1870s or so, and continuing until really the late 19 teens, by which point the modern steel skeleton frame is pretty well set. And people are patenting and people are inventing all sorts of things. Some of them are just bizarre. And what's interesting is some of the bizarre ones were used, and I've come across them in the field. But the really bizarre ones, maybe there's 2 or 3 examples of them. Sometimes even when there's somebody very knowledgeable behind them. Rafael Guastavino patented a floor to be used in steel buildings to span between the beams. Guastavino knew what he was doing, but that floor wasn't very popular because of economic issues and the fact that basically his company wasn't willing to relinquish control over their system. So the outliers in the end don't really give you the story. And the outliers are the ones that are sort of putting aside the narrative of the history of building technology. They're the ones that are very interesting. They're very showy. So what you have to do is look at the boring buildings, and the boring buildings are where people just use the common readily available technology and they put up a building, which gets you to the idea that, you know, there's a skyscraper vernacular. What if you want to build a tall building and you know, you're not looking to build the tallest building in the world, you're not looking to build the fanciest office building in Chicago, what do you build? And the answer is you use the off-the-shelf technology, as George said earlier. You use the average of what is available, not the state of the art, but the average. And that is a different story than the narrative of, you know, the great inventor comes up with an idea for steel framing or comes up with the idea for a curtain wall. It is unfortunately a more boring narrative. I think that's one of the reasons it hasn't gotten much traction. But I have to point out that that's the way the history of technology is dealt with in every other field of technology. If you're looking at the history of airplanes, yeah, there are all sorts of strange things people have flown, but that's not where the real story is. It's only in the building world where we have this huge established mass of architectural history that it's more difficult to get the technological narrative moving.
The other piece that is part of the story, when Will Price was designing the Blenheim, his first big reinforced concrete hotel in Atlantic City, the building was supposed to be built of steel, and there was a steel shortage, and he was told, switch it to concrete. So they redesigned it for concrete. And so, you know, the economics and the moment of the market begins to be a major force that changes the way things happen. Will signed the contracts for the train war the night before World War I broke out.
You.
And the banker said to him the next day, if we were still on this today, your damn building would have never been built. So, you know, a lot of it is chance and the world that we're in.
George, Don raised an issue that I wanted to bring back to you, and that was about Wilson's architecture after he left the Pennsy. Was he ever able to achieve another building that had this type of pseudo-industrial repetitive piece that he achieved in the Fair buildings?
No, I think that was always, you know, at the back of it. Well, not so. He did the amazing Denimara market down in South America, which is basically a gigantic steel frame built by William Sellers, you know, made by William Sellers the parts, and assembled in British Guiana. That is just a classic fair building turned into a market. Amazing thing. If you Google, you know, the Denimara market in British Guiana, you'll come up with beautiful photographs. The market has been restored, and it's quite amazing. Big roof flaps that pick up for light and ventilation. And you know, then the other piece, of course, is that Wilson did the greatest train sheds in America, and built, you know, the last surviving one that is so amazing here in Philly is Reading Terminal, with its extraordinary structure. That is, you know, they were going to demolish that, but in the 70s, Ed Bacon was going to get rid of that along with all the other, you know, the Frank Furness buildings and everything. And we fought him to a standstill and got the feds to say that they would take away the money for his underground railroad connection if he touched Reading Terminal. And so we still have Reading Terminal.
I'm afraid we're past the time that we should continue to intrude. We have so much richness, and I think we've exposed themes tonight, and as well as didn't get around to some of the really sinking our teeth into this objection that George has to the exclusive narrative of modernist architecture with its Eurocentric and New York-based and Chicago-based focus.
I'm okay with New York. I just hate Chicago and Europe.
Okay. Okay. So, well, there may be some peace on that point, but I think I know that these are topics that we could continue to talk about for many more hours. We will, at least with 1 hour in December, I think it's December 8th, that I'm going to outline the kind of an overview of some of the points of view that were discussed during the semester, and I think the kind of historical lenses that bring a focus to materials that pull some things into focus but leaves others out, right? Leaves other fuzzy. So we have returned to the history of technology, of engineering, of primacy and debates about what is the first example, or if you can indeed identify a first example, or if the idea of example falls apart when you simply emphasize first. So these are all things that we can talk about at much greater length, and we will. So I thank you all very much for participating tonight, and I will give George the last word in case he wants to put in a particular plug for his point of view. And Jerry's got one point too.
Only because
I defer to Jerry, who I think had his hand up first.
Go ahead,
you
Jerry.
showed your books, and you showed my blog, but the address is thearchitectureprofessor.com. That's all.
Great.
Enjoy.
And George?
And I would just say that this has been so much fun. I mean, I spend most of my spare time with engineers who I find are the only people who can speak truth to power. Nick Giannopoulos, who was the great engineer of Keystone Hood for so many years, and I stood looking at a group of buildings in Philadelphia that had been built with very picturesque brickwork, and they were replacing all of the lintels. And he looked at me and he said, you know, nothing of the 20th century is going to survive into the 22nd.
Well, we shall see. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. Come back in a week or so. We scholars will continue our discussions and debates too, and hopefully share some of the conclusions about where we can agree and where we find the most fruitful areas for disagreement. So thanks everybody. See you next time.